my speech is something that is somehow related to the theme that we've been covering this afternoon, which is unity. It's called The Roots of the Immigration Emergency in Europe, an Interreligious Response. So, dear friends, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, everyone, the term global village or global community that we use today to describe the human, political, and technological interconnectedness and interdependence and unity of the nations of the world, of civilizations, societies, religions, and individuals, dates back at least half a century to the sociologist Marshall McLuhan, who popularized this definition. However, the concept was already prophesied and described by the scientist Nicholas Tasia in 1926. Instant communication from all corners of the earth have forced us into an awareness and caring about the well-being or the suffering of populations once far from our consciences, but today intermingling with us, knocking at our doors, living in our midst, or at the very least, touching our lives, much like the water that splashes on all shores of a lake when a pebble is thrown into it, creating circular ripples that reach the shores. Whether or not we like or want this, the social, political, and economic injustices that produce wars and constantly produce political and economic refugees touch and profoundly influence our own lives. The former president of the European Commission, Jacques Delors, from 1985 to 1995, he was the president of the EC, introduced the idea that Europe needs a soul. And we have been speaking of this need of a soul for Europe for decades. Great statesmen and religious leaders of all faiths have repeatedly expressed concern that without spiritual cohesion, the European Union risks becoming a useless bureaucracy, unable to cope with the increased demands of the multi-ethnic, multi-religious society that Europe has become. Meetings, conventions, panels, articles, books, films, television talk shows have centered on this new reality, but no think tank has been able to devise an adequate political and social program that can successfully meet the human urgencies of this continent, which are intimately interwoven with the crises of the countries and continents from which an incessant human tsunami daily delivers desperate refugees onto the Mediterranean shores of Europe. They seek asylum and a future on the European continent, but we are increasingly unable to satisfy their basic needs and hopes. We grapple with great difficulty with the tasks of welcoming all and supplying all with the necessary tools for integration, housing, further education, vocational training, help in finding jobs, and above all, recognizing their dignity as individual human beings. Religious as well as secular NGOs and government agencies try to cope, but the numbers of daily arrivals are beyond control. In addition, there is insufficient coordination between nations on a European level. The soul of Europe, alas, does not shine upon this emergency. The economic crisis that has exploded with different degrees of severity in all our different European countries has widened the gap between the rich and the poor, between the haves and the have-nots, creating a general sense of social and personal insecurity. Proverbially, in times like these, fear of the stranger, that is xenophobia, and conspiracy theories abound, resulting in all forms of racism, anti-Semitism, homophobia, Islamophobia, and so on. The search for scapegoats on whom to blame the origins of this economic and social malaise is widespread. Given the generally destitute condition of homeless immigrants landing daily on our shores from Africa, Asia, the Middle East, Eastern Europe, Latin America, from countries where people find no hope for their future, seeking escape from the furor of wars, reduced to extreme poverty, caught in the nets of totalitarian regimes that govern their existence, These people, in their extreme need and vulnerability, are incorrectly perceived as an additional, albeit imaginary, threat to the general sense of insecurity in a growing sense of European citizens. These days, we are witnessing the rise of the xenophobic political right. The French elections with the triumph of Marie Le Pen's party is the most recent example, and can be added to similar political entities in Holland, Greece, Hungary, Italy, to countries across Europe. Predictably, we see a massive rise of these parties all over the continent in the forthcoming May elections for the European Parliament. Concomitant to the rise of the right is a rejection of the European Union and our common euro currency. These anti-EU parties are propagating the erroneously oversimplistic theory that by discarding the euro and returning to the old national currencies, the economic condition of these countries will take a turn for the better. Perhaps we need more professional economists skilled in the arts of public relations and communication to explain that precisely the opposite can be expected to happen. The dissolution of the European Union would not only awaken the chauvinistic national monsters of yesteryear, but would also plunge our countries into a depression reminiscent of the era preceding World War II. Sadly, it is close to useless to remind the new generations of the tragic mistakes of the 1900s that led up to 2 world wars and to the totalitarian regimes that lasted for a good part of the past century. The oft-mentioned warning by the 19th century philosopher George Santayana that those who do not remember the past are condemned to repeat it goes unheeded. It seems that all educational efforts to prevent political extremisms and racism from resurging have little or no effect when confronted with the emotional rhetoric of populist parties that play on the xenophobic fears and psychological weaknesses of the credulous and the underprivileged. The immigrant population in Europe is today the primary scapegoat of this poisonous spiral, but other groups will soon follow, including the religious minorities in each country. I'm referring in particular to rising anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. What can we, as representatives of cultures and religions engaged in the quest for peace and a just society, do to counteract this growing threat of intolerance and violence in Europe? First of all, I believe we must extend our gaze beyond the horizons of Europe and take a closer look at the countries of origin of the refugee immigrants who knowingly and willingly risk their lives by crossing the Mediterranean in shaky boats, becoming victims of rackets run by all kinds of mafias. Why do they prefer to risk drowning rather than to remain in their own countries? Most of the countries from which they flee are raging with barbaric wars and or are ruled by dictators who have abolished even the most fundamental freedoms and are starving their own people. They are countries where military service is mandatory, often even for children, and from which there is no escape. They are countries where childhood is not respected and where children are the main victims, where human beings have no opportunities to realize their potentials. The possibilities for self-realization that we in Europe take for granted, to study, to freely exercise professions, trades, or businesses, exist in these countries only as unfulfilled dreams. The roots of the immigration emergency on the European continent are embedded in this abominable situation in the countries of origin of immigrants. In our global village, we are faced with a vicious cycle. Corrupt dictatorships and wars in Africa and Asia create nothing but despair for their people, resulting in a massive exodus towards the more developed world of the European continent. European governments and their citizens are called to integrate these immigrants, but with only meager success. Support, hospitality, education, and jobs are not found for all. Those left out join the ranks of the unemployed and homeless amongst EU citizens. EU countries have failed in their efforts to integrate a large number of recent refugees, as well as first and second generation immigrants already living here. The dire consequences include the growth of the extreme right in Europe, as we said before, as well as pseudo-religious political extremism among some immigrants, who often also fall victim to criminal organizations that supply them with their daily bread. What are we doing to improve conditions in the countries of origin of these refugees? Well, the EU is the world's largest collective donor of development aid, yet a nagging question arises. How much international aid actually arrives at its destination and is truly employed to achieve the goals that have been set? The path between donor and receiver is strewn with insidious obstacles, or as the folk adage goes, there is many a slip between the cup and the lip. According to the 12th century Jewish philosopher Moses Maimonides, also known as Rambam, the highest form of charity is to give anonymously, to make the other independent. Translated by another popular saying with which we are all familiar, don't give fish to a needy fisherman, give him a fishing rod so that he can catch the fish by himself. Most important of all, anyone who underwrites aid should be duty-bound to monitor the process, to make sure that the money reaches its destination intact and is really employed to further the target project. That's the main point that I'm trying to make in this long speech, which is putting some of you to sleep, and I'm sorry, you didn't have your coffee. Unfortunately, very often this is not the case. Money gets sifted away along the route. The examples of corruption are indeed plentiful and can include not only the governments of recipient countries, but also the inflated budgets in some donor agencies, or criminal behavior and intimidation among border police, or pressure groups with conflicting economic interests, vested interests. Examples that might be cited include the nearly $2 billion of European funds that the European Union had designated over the years to the Palestinian people, most of which ended up in PLO President Yasser Arafat's Swiss bank accounts instead of being invested in socially useful programs. Rather than use donor funds for their intended purposes, Arafat regularly diverted money to his own accounts. Or we could mention the $29 million looted by Tunisia's former president Ben Ali and recovered a year ago by the United Nations Stolen Asset Recovery Team. Such dishonesty was at the origin of the Arab Spring, the rebellion against corrupt leaders that began precisely in Tunisia. But Europe is not immune either. In asking ourselves what percentage of the funds earmarked for foreign aid actually arrive at destination and how much disappears along the way, we must begin by glancing at the list of corruption scandals in European countries that have brought down our own governments. Italy's present economic crisis, for example, is largely due to past misuse of funds on all levels. Similar situations have been recorded in other European countries. If we add this all up, we can easily see how a large part of aid disappears en route and never arrives to accomplish the aims for which it was intended. Every religious tradition has laid down precepts that are similar to those of Maimonides. The great problem is that we, as representatives of different faiths, have not yet learned to cooperate in concrete actions to apply this wisdom to internal and above all to international policy. While the commitment of religious and interreligious groups in welcoming and helping immigrants integrate into Europe will continue alongside governmental and NGO work, a great new challenge for interreligious cooperation might be that of aiming at eradicating the roots of the migrant crisis by creating an interreligious task force with a strategy for monitoring the entire process of aid from beginning to end. The clear aim would be to make sure that the finances are actually invested in those projects, whose goal it is to help create the conditions for economic independence and political freedom in the countries that are causing the immigrant crisis in Europe. Uniting multi-religious forces in a coalition of all faiths, working strategically in unity for this common goal, based on a common interreligious ethical platform, might effectively strengthen the efforts of committed governments and NGO representatives and provide a stronger bulwark against corruption. Perhaps this symposium could launch the beginnings of such a project. Thank you, and thanks for listening.